question is, how do we pay for it? It's really the trillion-dollar question. Whatever the agenda item is, whatever the policy proposal is, whether it's infrastructure or free college or Medicare for all or a Green New Deal, you get a politician who goes on a television show or sits down with a journalist and says, I've introduced legislation to do this thing. And the journalist responds by saying what? How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? As if that's the most important question to begin with, right? You're not debating the merits of the proposal. Well, tell me about Medicare for all. What is it that you think is broken with our current healthcare delivery system? And why do you think moving to Medicare for all? Those aren't the conversations we end up having. It becomes the pay for question first, and then we get bogged down in whose taxes have to go up and by how much and all of that stuff, right? So we never end up having the really important debates because of this question. So why do we always start with this question? What's behind the question? Because there's an ideological framework behind that question. The question presupposes certain things like, for example, that the government doesn't have the money to do these things. Where would the money come from, right? There's implicit in the question a concern about the budget, right? There's all this stuff behind that question. So we have to talk about that. And then I want to see whether it's possible for us as a nation to move beyond this question, to have better debates, to have better dialogue, to talk about the things that really matter and stop focusing always and everywhere on this one question: what is the impact on the deficit or the national debt going to be? How are we going to pay for it? So getting beyond the money question is the goal. Here's the problem. Okay, this is what, in a sense, we're up against in trying to get there. So this is a very short video. It's a couple of minutes, but it sets up the rest of the talk. So here we go.
Taking money from our children and borrowing from China.
Take out a credit card from the Bank of China in the name of our children, driving up our national debt that we are going to have to pay back. That's irresponsible. It's unpatriotic.
The government's irresponsible spending is turning us into slaves. You might well literally lock us into chains, at least our children.
We got to deal with this big long-term debt problem, or it will deal with us.
And it is
I'm asking you, join us to stop this fiscal train wreck. Join us to protect our children from an inferior standard of living, from a crushing burden of debt and taxes.
Okay, I don't believe in any of the tax cuts. I didn't want tax cuts for the rich. I didn't even want them for the middle class. Okay, because you know why? Because it puts a $400 billion hole in the budget, and we just can't afford it.
And as we discuss deficit reduction, which is clearly a major issue.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future.
And the deficit thing is real, and the debt thing is real. We are really in trouble on it at some point.
Is there need for comprehensive deficit reduction? The answer is not only yes, but hell yes.
This debt that hangs over our head, a government that spends more money than it takes in. That's not sustainable.
You know, you cannot cut taxes or increase spending unless you can pay for it.
The math of federal spending does not add up.
And we are spending money we do not have.
We have a debt burden that's crushing us.
To me, this is more of a moral issue. You can't steal from your kids and grandkids.
Deficit. We think the deficit and the national debt are at a moral level.
National debt is America's biggest problem.
Wow. Right? Bipartisan. If you watched the video, the way that it was put together, it essentially went Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. This is a bipartisan chorus when it comes to this issue. I know they say that Washington can't agree on anything. That's baloney. There is widespread agreement when it comes to the national debt and deficit spending, right? Both parties, now they'll blame each other for who's responsible for having a national debt, but both of them, at least rhetorically, will tell you that this is a disaster for the nation, right? Bad things are going to happen as a result. And what I want to do is remind you that it's always been this way. Okay, this isn't new. The rhetoric isn't new. You saw Reagan, but it goes far back in history before Ronald Reagan. This is a cartoon from a newspaper in 1937. Okay, this is when, oh my God, the national debt is 36 billion with a B, $billion, right? High as a skyscraper, taller than Mount Everest and all that kind of stuff, right? So then from 1937, move through the 1940s, financing World War II, the national debt grows, all of a sudden it's 49 billion with an expectation we're going up to 65 billion. Oh, the water's fine, don't worry, right? It's all a big joke, gloom and doom. Ronald Reagan finishes and they erect a monument in this cartoon. This is Reagan's legacy, 1.5 trillion, now with a T. And then 3 trillion. And then when Clinton leaves office, 5.7 trillion. And then it's 7.5 trillion. And then it's up to 9. And then 10. And then 13. 14, the poor child. 15, it's eating through the country. 16 trillion, the monsters are upon us. 17 trillion, the Democrats and Republicans are kicking the can down the curb. 17 trillion rolling in on our children and grandchildren. 18 trillion now so big it no longer fits on Earth. It is an interstellar problem, $18 trillion. 19 trillion, a cancer on America. 20 trillion, the Titanic, catastrophe ahead. And where we are today, gross national debt, $21 trillion. All along the way, year after year after year, the debt continues to grow. The cartoonists, the pundits, the warnings, the hysteria, it's always been with us. It's always been with us. Okay, the sky is always falling. And so what I would like this afternoon to be is essentially a form of group therapy, because we need it, okay? Because they're scaring us with these stories about how it's unpatriotic, how it's burdening the next generation, how it's dooming us to a future of higher taxes, catastrophe for the nation, right? And I want to try to lower the temperature, get us to the point where we can, at whatever age it's legal to do so, open a nice bottle of red wine, read the newspaper, see the headline, national debt is at an all-time high, and have that nice glow about us and feel at peace with the world, right? There's no reason to panic, and I'll try to walk you through how I think we should be looking at some of these things. But it does require a change in the way we think, a paradigm shift, right? We have to begin to see these things not as problems, but in a different light. And so that's what I want to try to do. I think the biggest mistake that we make is thinking of the federal government like a household. It's that household analogy. It's the idea that Uncle Sam is just like one of us, right? The federal government operates like a household. I have a budget constraint. I can't spend more than I make year after year. I can't continue to take on more and more debt and end up okay at the end of the day. Therefore, the federal government can't do that either, right? I analogize from my individual personal household to the nation as a whole, and I say, if I can't do it, they can't do it. If it's bad for me, it's bad for everyone, right? The government's budget is nothing like a household budget. This is the problem. They're not like us. Their budget doesn't work the way our budgets work. Deficit spending by the federal government isn't the same as you and I spending more than we make year after year. Borrowing by the federal government isn't the same as you and I going out and putting money on a credit card. One of us issues the currency. They do. The other one of us, you and I, are merely using the US dollar. So we have a distinction to make between currency issuers and currency users. The issuer of the currency, the federal government in this case, can never run out of it, can never go broke, can never have bills coming due that it can't afford to pay, can't become insolvent, can't end up like people you may know, right, who took on too much debt and got into trouble and were forced into bankruptcy. So this is the biggest hurdle, is getting beyond thinking of the government as a household, like, you know, personalizing it. So I want to try, in the time that remains, to tackle 5 big questions. I'm going to try to do it in close to 5 minutes. It's going to take a little bit longer, but these are the 5 big questions that I want us to look at. First, what is the deficit? Most people who have very strong emotional reactions to the idea of a government deficit can't tell you what it is. Okay, so we want to talk about that. Same thing goes with the national debt. In fact, people often conflate the two, the deficit and the debt. So what is this deficit? What is the national debt? What is this obsession with China? You heard it again and again, borrowing from China. Take out a credit card and Bank of China in the name of our children. China, China, China. So let's talk about China. Don't we eventually have to pay it back? And if 21 trillion becomes 22, then 23, then 25, then 30, then how are we ever going to retire this thing, right? Do we have to eventually pay it back? And then the question, which is what I organized the talk around, what can we afford, right? What can we afford? If we have all of these ambitious things that we as a nation might like to do, if there's broad support for programs for repairing and rebuilding crumbling infrastructure, do we have the resources to do it? And how do we pay for it? What can we afford to do? Okay, so those are the 5 big questions. The first one is the deficit question. What is the deficit? So I want us to suppose that I'm the federal government, and I'm going to spend 10 of these into the economy, and you're going to be my economy. So I'm going to spend these 10 into the economy, and this handsome young man, my husband, is going to take these 10, right? And so I just spent 10 into the economy. So there they are, right? They're there, and they're here with him. But now I'm the government, so I'm going to tax some of those away. So give me back 4. I'm going to take 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, thank you for participating. I have taxed away 4. Okay? So this is a government deficit. That's what the deficit is. It means the government spends more into the economy than it taxes back out. So I did this thing called deficit spending. And my record, my budget, is going to record a deficit, -6, right? That is my deficit. But guess what? The economy has a record as well. And the economy's record is going to show what? +6. Show me that 6. There it is. It's real. That's the surplus that was created as a result of my deficit spending. So my deficit, my red ink, is your black ink. Okay, here it is with actual historical data for the US going back to 1960. The red line is my account balance. Okay, the red line is my financial balance. The black line is the private sector in the US. It's all the households, it's all the businesses in the US combined. And what do you notice? I'm almost always in the red, my budget is almost always in deficit, and yours is almost always in surplus. And not only that, they tend to move opposite one another, meaning when I run bigger deficits, you all end up with bigger surpluses, okay? So my red ink is your black ink. So when you see a headline like this one, right, from the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago, trillion-dollar deficits could be the new normal. This is meant to shock and frighten. Trillion-dollar deficits could be the new normal, but take a breath and read it this way. Watch the word deficit. Don't you feel better? Don't you feel better? Trillion-dollar surpluses could be the new normal. Oh, all right. I'm down. I'm okay, right? Maybe that's not a bad thing, is what I'm suggesting. Look at the problem, or is it a problem, from a different angle. Okay, I see a surplus. I see a deficit. Well, stand over here, right? Because if you see a deficit, you're looking at it from the perspective of the federal government. But look at it from your perspective. You're in the private sector. If you look at it from your perspective, you don't see the deficit, you see the surplus, okay? Because that's what's accumulating as a result. So, whoops, want to back up just one. So now let's talk about, we know what the deficit is. We know that my deficits become your financial surpluses. Let's talk about the national debt. What is the national debt? So remember, I ran this thing called a budget deficit. I spent 10 into the economy, I only taxed 4 back. I left him with 6. But when I run deficits, I borrow, okay? That's how the federal government currently does things. And so if I deficit spend 6, then I borrow 6. So I've got 6 of these things. Yes, I do, 6 of these things. And I'm going to sell him these things called treasury bonds. So he's going to give me the money that I gave him, and I'm going to give him the treasury bonds. So that That cash now is gone, and we have swapped it for treasury bonds. And that's what the national debt is. The national debt is all of the outstanding treasury bonds that the government spent the money into the economy, didn't tax it back, and then traded the cash for a different financial instrument called a security, a government bond, okay? So the entire national debt is nothing more than a record, a historical record of all of the dollars that were spent into the economy, not taxed back, and are currently being held in the form of US treasuries. That's all the national debt is. All right, so if you happen to hold some of those things, they're your assets. They're in your portfolio. If you're an investor, you might have some of those things. Okay, they're very nice to have. They're safe. They're liquid. They're default risk-free. They help you diversify your portfolio. You can take risks elsewhere, but you can hold some treasuries, right? And they pay interest. And so if you see this clock up here, I took a snapshot yesterday. So this thing runs in real time, and it's meant to scare people, right? The national debt, tick, 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 tick. Those numbers just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, look, now that you know what the national debt is, nothing more than the historical record of all of the dollars that were spent into the economy and not taxed back, currently being held in the form of treasury securities, you can look at that debt clock and watch the name. It becomes the US dollar savings clock. So now we don't have to get so anxious because it doesn't have the word debt any longer. Now we know it's just an asset clock. Okay, it's recording all of the dollars that are currently being held in the form of treasuries as somebody's savings. So now don't you feel better? Okay, see, I see smiles and heads nodding. So we're already making progress in group therapy. Number 3, China. What are we going to do with China? So here's the question people say. I know China holds so much of our debt, though. And then they just leave it there as if that's supposed to automatically explain why that's a bad thing. Say, so okay, China holds some US treasuries, about $1 trillion currently. So where did they get them? Where did China get US treasuries? So I'm going to show you. So China, I would like to buy some of the things that are made in China. Okay, and I'm going to pay with US dollars. This is my daughter. She plays with these. They're squishies. They're made in China. So we import things from China. They manufacture, they put on containers, they ship to us. We get them. We import them. They export them to us. We pay with dollars. So I have the stuff, right? China's people, the Chinese are working in factories, manufacturing, giving their time, using their resources, producing this stuff. They don't keep and consume and enjoy for themselves. They ship it to us, and we pay with dollars. So now China has a checking account at the Federal Reserve. Okay, they have dollars in their account at a bank here in the US called the Fed. So now China has a decision to make. I can sit and hold my dollars in my checking account, or I can spend them, right? I could buy some of the stuff the US manufacturers. I could buy real estate or other things priced in dollars, or I could buy treasuries because treasuries pay interest. So maybe I don't want to keep my dollars in a checking account. Maybe I would prefer to transfer my dollars into a savings account, which is nothing more than a securities account at the Fed. So this is borrowing from China. Watch. I'm borrowing from China. There, I did it. I borrowed from China. Okay, now China has the treasury bond. I have the stuff. And I've borrowed from China. Okay, that's what borrowing from China means. So the question then becomes, what if they won't buy our bonds any longer? What if they, because we think that somehow everything is made in China, including the US dollar. And to get more dollars to spend, we need China, right? No, we don't. Okay, so what if China decides, I don't want to buy treasuries anymore? Well, that's perfectly fine. China could decide to just keep their dollars in their checking account at the Fed. It'd be kind of silly to give up the interest, but, you know, they could decide to do that. would that harm the U.S.? Would it prevent us from, being able to finance other projects, infrastructure, and so forth? The answer is no. Okay, I think we're going to get to explore that a little bit more, maybe in the Q&A, but I just want to give it away. Here is Secretary Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, just the other day in Reuters article. This is just from 3 days ago. Mnuchin is asked, are you worried about China refusing to buy treasuries and so forth? He says, I don't lose any sleep over it. Okay, and he's right not to. What do we really owe China? So I have a friend who's a bond trader. He's a fixed income guy, trades government bonds, and his name is Warren Mosler. And Warren will often say, the only thing we owe China is a bank statement. Okay, he's being a little bit funny, but essentially at the end of the day, that's about it. Okay, what do we owe China? A bank statement. Okay, we already got the stuff. We traded it for a treasury. And at the end of the day, as long as China wants to orient its economy around exporting in order to grow, in order to create jobs, then we're the beneficiary in this bargain, right? And we can talk, as I said, we can talk more about that. So there are politics involved in all of this, and look, when it comes to the national debt, both sides do this, and the deficit too. You blew up the national debt. You did this bad thing that added to deficits. The Democrats are doing it to the Republicans now because of the tax cuts that were recently passed, right? You added to the national debt, you blew up deficits and all this kind of stuff. When the shoe is on the other foot, the Republicans do the same thing to the Democrats. So it is, again, it's both sides pointing fingers. When I was working on the Hill in the Senate, one of my favorite things to do was to ask elected officials or their staffers, if you had a magic wand, and you could wave the magic wand and eliminate the national debt tomorrow, would you do it? Everyone said, what do you think? Of course, yes, I would eliminate the national debt with my magic wand, no hesitation whatsoever. And I say, okay, what if I give you a different wand? And I ask you if you would like to, you can wave this magic wand and you can eliminate US treasuries. They'll just be gone from the face of the earth tomorrow. How many people do you think would wave the wand? How many members of the Senate would wave the wand to eradicate the world of treasury securities? And you just get a total look of, like, why are you, I don't understand the question. You say, that's okay, you already answered it, right? Eliminating the national debt means eliminating all of those safe securities called US treasuries that people like to hold in their portfolios, because that's what the national debt is. You pay off the debt, you eliminate the debt, there are no more treasury securities anywhere. They're done. All right, so here is a historical lesson. There have been 7 times in our nation's history when the government has begun to run budget surpluses and pay down the debt. 7 times in our nation's history. We did it from 1817 to 1821. The federal government's budget was in surplus. It's collecting more in taxes than it's putting back into the economy by spending, and so the national debt is being paid down. And we did it for a period of time. What happened? Had a depression that started in 1819. We did it again from 1823 to 1836 under Andrew Jackson. Actually paid off the national debt. What happened? Depression in 1837. Then we did it again, began to pay down the national debt. Depression. Not recession, depression. Deep, protracted, right? Contraction in the economy. Bad situation. The last time we did it was under President Bill Clinton, 98 through 2001. The budget was in surplus. The government began to pay down the debt. What happened? The economy went into recession in 2001, and we ended up with the Great Recession just a handful of years later. So why does that happen? Why does something that sounds so good and fiscally responsible, running some budget surpluses and paying down debt, why does it tend to coincide with bad economic consequences? Why do we end up with depressions in the Great Recession? And very quickly, because we could talk for an hour just about, about this picture. But I want to just show you, this is where we were with Bill Clinton. That is the government's budget moving into surplus. You can see the red. That's the government's deficit. Government's almost always in deficit. But there were those 4 years right there under Bill Clinton when the government's budget moved into surplus. And there was great celebration, right? This is the first time in generations that the budget has been in surplus. This is the fiscally responsible thing to do. You know, Democrats delivered this. Well, yeah, but guess what? Look what happened to the private sector's financial position, right? It was built on the backs of the private sector. The private sector's financial balance went deeply in the red, and that's what allowed the public sector's balance to move temporarily into the black. But it didn't last, and it can't last. Why? Because it was driven by primarily households spending more than their income, borrowing on the back of a dot-com bubble and then a housing bubble, and eventually the whole thing unravels. Too much debt, mostly for households, okay? And so it's unsustainable when the private sector does it, with households driving, but it's perfectly sustainable for the federal government's budget to remain in deficit for a period of decades. So last question here, what can we afford? This is how we think government spending works. We think that the government is broke. We think that they need our money. We think that they come first to us, either to tax or to borrow, the tab, taxing and borrowing. That the government raises revenue by taxing us and by borrowing money, then it has money that it can then spend into the economy. So the fight is always who's going to pick up the tab, who's going to pay for it, because the financing has to come from somewhere. The money has to come from somewhere, and it will be the taxpayers, or it will be borrowing, which is the same as saying deficit spending, which is the same as saying putting it on the credit card, adding to the debt. Okay, because this is how we think this is how it's supposed to work. And so the fights are all about who's going to pay for it, whose taxes are going to go up, who's going to be paying for it, right? So you get somebody like Senator Sanders, who put forward an ambitious economic platform, right? Wants to do $1 trillion of infrastructure, wants to make public colleges and universities tuition-free, wants to transition to a healthcare system based on, built around Medicare for all, wants to be, you've heard, right? This ambitious program. And his opponent in the Democratic primary, you know, kind of in her book, this is from her book, What Happened, she says, you know, it was like every time we tried to offer something, he offered something bigger. And it was like, you know, hey, I think, you know, Bernie's saying, I think America should get a pony. And Hillary says, how are you going to pay for the pony? Because it's all so fantastical. It's so out of reach. It's a pony, right? It's not realistic. So in DC, where I worked on the budget committee, there is a great deal of pressure to pay for things. There is a lot of pressure for people, especially when they're running for president, to show that they have the money to make good on whatever policies they're putting forward. So if you say you're going to make public colleges and universities tuition-free, somebody wants you to draw a line to the source of revenue. Where's the money coming from? And so Senator Sanders did that. And he said, well, we'll pay for it with a tax on Wall Street speculation, a financial transactions tax. Wall Street will pay for it. He did it with infrastructure and with other programs. When he said, well, we'll close tax loopholes, or we'll have, you know, raise the cap on FICA withholdings, and we'll fine the billionaires and corporations, and the rich will pay for it, right? When we talk about the wall, President Trump did the same thing. Mexico will pay for it, right? The money has to come from somewhere, and so everybody's trying to pay for it. So here's where I wish we were, and this is very close to the end. Where I wish we were was having an entirely different conversation and a very different national debate. And if I had a little bit more time, I would show you this video clip, but I've seen it so many times, I'm just going to tell you what it does. So that is Alan Greenspan, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve for a period of time before Ben Bernanke, right? You may remember. So here's Alan Greenspan under oath before Congress answering a question from Congressman Paul Ryan. And Paul Ryan is asking him a question about Social Security, because whenever these discussions and debates come up about the national debt and our budget picture, national budget, people say it's entitlements that are the problem. It's Medicare, it's Social Security, it's Medicaid. These are the real drivers of our long-term fiscal crisis or challenge, right? They point to entitlements. So here's Greenspan sitting there under oath, And he's asked this question by Congressman Paul Ryan. Don't you agree with me that now is the time to begin to move toward a system of personal retirement accounts? This is privatizing Social Security. Now is the time to begin to transition to a system of personal retirement accounts, because we all know Social Security is going broke and we can't afford to make good on promises. Okay, that's what Ryan asked Greenspan. And Greenspan said, no, I don't agree with you. I don't agree with you at all. And then he goes on to say, and the quote is here. All right, so the first part is here. There's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone. Whoa. When did anybody ever go on TV and tell you that? Right? There's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants to and paying it to someone. So he has completely taken the affordability question off the table. We don't have to ask whether we can make good on promises to future retirees, their dependents, and the disabled. We can. We can make good on every promise in perpetuity. Nothing to stop us from doing that. Then he goes on to make the really important point that we should be having an entire national debate around. And his next sentence is this. The question is, how do you set up a system which assures that the real assets are created, which those benefits are employed to purchase? What does that mean? It means that we have demographic changes taking place in this country. More and more people who are today working are going to be moving into retirement this year, next year, the following year, the boomers, right? They're already leaving the labor force and moving into retirement, and that's going to continue for some time. And it's going to leave behind fewer and fewer people who are working and producing the stuff. But the boomers, once they retire, they don't stop consuming. They continue to consume. They just stop helping us to produce the stuff. So Greenspan's point is, how do you set up a system which assures that the real assets, the stuff, is created so that when those benefit payments go out to future retirees, their dependents, and the disabled, they can do what? Spend that money into an economy that is productive enough, there's enough stuff being produced that we don't get what kind of a problem? Inflation, I heard it. Because if the economy is not productive enough 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, and the checks go out, then we're all going to be competing for a smaller and smaller quantity of actual stuff. And we're going to create an inflation problem. And inflation is every central banker's public enemy number one. That's what he's worried about. Okay, so can you imagine if instead of saying Social Security is going broke, we have to cut benefits, the system is unsustainable, forget all of that. If instead of that, we were saying, what are the things that we can do today? What are the investments we can make today to increase the odds that in 5, 10, 20 years, the US economy is productive enough that we can make good on all of those promises without causing an inflation problem? The Republicans would say what? Tax cuts and deregulation are the best ways to produce an economy that is, maximum growth and high productivity. And the Democrats would say what? Education, infrastructure, R&D, but at least we would be having the right debate. Right? At least we would be having a good, constructive, productive debate over the real issues that matter instead of this phony, where the money is running out sort of debate. So that's where I wish we were. The US government is never going to run out of the US dollar. The US government is the scorekeeper for the dollar. It can't run out of dollars any more than a carpenter can run out of inches, or the scorekeeper here at Stony Brook can run out of points when the football team is putting up 77 points in a game, and all the fans are sitting in the audience going, oh my God, what happens if they score again? They're never going to have enough points to put up. Yes, they will. They can't run out. The stadium can't run out of points. The US government can't run out of dollars. It's a unit, right? The government spends by instructing its bank to change the numbers in someone's account upward. That's how we pay for things. It's not actually by physically printing money and making payments. It's all done electronically, okay? So that's how it really works. The spending comes first. Congress authorizes a budget. That's how it's supposed to work. The House and the Senate write a budget, there's budget resolution, the president signs the budget, and there's authorization is given, right? Budgetary authorization comes through appropriations, and the agencies are told this is how much money you have to spend. And the government begins spending, right? The spending happens first, and once people receive income from the government's spending, people start paying taxes, and now there's money to also buy those bonds. Remember, I spent it before I taxed it back or sold the bonds. So this is from a talk, a series of talks I gave just over this summer in London, one at the British Public Library and one in the House of Lords. This is the debate I wish we were having. Instead of getting bogged down in the pay for question, focus on the real things that matter. What can we afford? The answer isn't in financial terms, the answer is in real terms. If we want to do $1 trillion of infrastructure and somebody says, how are you going to pay for it? You should say, I'm going to pay for it by hiring 300,000 construction workers, by using X tons of steel, by using 2 or 3% of our unused spare capacity in our factories, by mobilizing this many machines and heavy equipment. And so that's how you pay for it. Real resources. And if you don't have them, if the economy is already operating at full employment and everybody's being used, all the workers are already employed, all the resources are currently being used, then you can't afford it, right? But if you have spare capacity, if you have idle people, if you have idle machines, if the raw materials are there, then the government can step in and say, now would be a good time because we can mobilize these resources in a responsible way. That means without causing inflation, without competing for those resources with other people who are currently using. They're not being used. We can hire them, put them to work, and improve the standard of living, right? In the interest of the public good. So thank you very much.
So thank you so much. That was spectacular. And I think my head's still spinning a little bit in trying to get my around it all the way. Who's listening? I mean, this is obviously a novel idea. Who's listening, and are you seeing progress as you're putting these ideas out?
Yes. Well, lots of people are listening. So I think, just in the last, I would say, 1.5 to 2 years, there seems to have been a real lurch forward with these ideas, both in terms of, the media interest, cover stories, headline, big kind of feature pieces just on the ideas themselves. And then people running for office who are trying to find a better way to dialogue with their constituents. They're going to debates and they're running for public office, or elected officials who are just reaching out and saying, look, I want to talk about this stuff in a better way. Can you help me find ways that I can be comfortable with, but recognizing that it's a departure from the way they've been doing it. So I think lots of people are listening.
So to go back to one of your central points, if the deficit is really not the right guide, and you kind of answered part of this question, but what really should policymakers be looking at when they're trying to make a decision? And I think, again, in your wrap-up, I think you kind of answered some of there. Are other things besides just understanding what the costs are going to be in terms of materials and so on?
Yeah, so one of the things, I mentioned inflation, but that's not the only consideration. So, I mean, right now, legislation is run by the Congressional Budget Office, and that's the sort of Washington scorekeeper. They look at legislation that's been proposed, and they give members of Congress feedback. And they try to help them figure out, am I going to vote for or against this piece of legislation? But most of the feedback they give is, this will be the impact on deficits going forward, and this will be the impact on the national debt. And what I'm suggesting is that it would be useful to have CBO go beyond, and maybe not even do that, but certainly to go beyond and say, look, you want to expand the earned income tax credit. This is how many kids would be lifted out of poverty if you were to do that. This is, you want to provide these tax cuts and, look at the Republican tax cuts and say, there's this measure called the Gini coefficient. It's a measure of income inequality or wealth inequality in the country. Let us talk about what that might do to inequality if we pass this legislation. So I think that would be useful feedback.
So the U.S. obviously has still, I guess, U.S. and China now have the dominant economies in the world, but can any sovereign nation adopt this policy in terms of, you're producing the money, you're going to spend it, or is it constricted by, the markets for currencies, things like that, in terms of who can do this? I'm thinking of Greece, for example. Clearly they ran into problems in the EU with overspending and so on. So can any nation do this?
Yeah, so you used the magic words, which are sovereign currency. And so what happened with Greece is that Greece was, operating with the drachma. They had a sovereign currency until they didn't, until they gave it up in favor of this new thing called the euro. And once Greece gave up the sovereign currency and started borrowing in a currency that's essentially foreign to them, it invites all kinds of problems. But the US has a sovereign currency, the UK does, Japan, Canada, Mexico. So those countries could make maximum use of their domestic resources. They can afford to buy whatever's for sale in their domestic currency.
So we've been hearing for years and years, obviously, and you showed it so well in your video, the debt's terrible, the deficit's terrible, and so on. How do we do a better job of educating the public on monetary policy? Because it's different. What you're talking about is quite different in terms of how to look at it.
And it's a Herculean task because there's so much disinformation that it takes, to coin a phrase, to turn a phrase, it takes a village, in a sense, to combat this. I mean, you really do need, it's not enough for just academia to come aboard. I think that part of what helped push this message forward was when financial journalists in particular became interested in MMT and started writing about these ideas. So, people putting better questions to our politicians, writing better articles for people to digest, telling better stories on the news, it's going to take a lot of work.
So you mentioned, and I think I mentioned in my introduction, that you were an economic advisor for the Sanders campaign in 2016. How did that happen? How did you get engaged with it?
I had, so I didn't start advising the campaign until after I left the budget committee. So it was, 2 weeks, there's my husband, 2 weeks before Christmas, 2014, and I got a phone call from him. And the Democrats had just lost the Senate, and so the Senate was going to flip, and he was going to be the ranking member of the budget committee starting in 2015, and he needed to hire a chief economist to advise members of the Democratic caucus on the budget committee. So he called, and we had a conversation, and then he called 2 days later, and we had almost the same conversation. And at the end of that call, he asked if I would come and do this job in Washington. So just a couple of weeks before Christmas, with kids that were much younger, I picked up and moved to Washington and worked on the budget committee. So we knew each other from that time. And then when he decided to run for president, and I finished my year and a bit on the budget committee, then I started advising the campaign.
But it sounds like from what you said, it was still difficult to get him, at least in the current political environment, to not point to ways in which things would be paid for. Is that fair?
Yeah, and it's tough because, I show up in January, and I think he announced he was going to run for president in May. So, this is someone who I think has prided himself on consistency in message for many, many years. And there's so much pressure, as I said in the talk, there's so much pressure to show everyone exactly where the money's going to come from. And if you don't do that, they say you're not serious. And then when you do that, they tell you the math doesn't add up. So it's just sort of can't win.
What are some of the other constraints, kind of, in getting this done? And what are some of the incentives that you can give to people to try and adopt this in leadership?
Well, the constraints, I mean, they're all self-imposed. That's the worst part of this, is that the constraints aren't real. They're just, they're self-imposed. They're sort of, this is the way these are the expectations of people who put forward legislation, that there will be a pay-for attached. And I think that, one of the funny things that happened is with the Republican tax cuts, I think it pushed the door open for the Democrats. And so a lot of them are calling me now and saying things like, well, if they don't have to pay for anything, we don't have to pay for anything. And so in a way, I think the Republicans kind of advanced the agenda here with their tax cuts.
And do you think the infrastructure argument is stronger or versus the tax cut or as incentive argument for economic growth? I mean, have you thought about that, or that? Because obviously you talked about that could play out now in a public debate, which would be much more productive than talking about the idea of the deficit. But do you have a side?
Yeah. So economists will say the multiplier effect, how much bang for the buck. So if government does $1 trillion of infrastructure investment, assessment. What are the benefits to the economy as a whole in terms of where does the money go, in whose hands does the money find itself, and then how much of it do they re-spend into the economy, and so you get a multiplier effect, versus tax cuts that are skewed disproportionately to the people at the top, who then turn around and spend, only a very little amount back into the economy. So, if you're comparing $1 trillion of infrastructure alongside $1 trillion tax cut, most economists would say the infrastructure is more bang for the buck.
So you mentioned one of the risks being inflation potentially in terms of this, and of course inflation more acutely affects lower income, lower asset individuals. So how does that risk kind of weigh into the monetary fiscal policy as you think about it?
So the point that I'm trying to make here is that you want to make efficient use, judicious use of the budget and efficient use of the resources that you have without putting a strain on the economy. And so really the goal is to avoid the kind of inflation that can be punishing. I mean, that's a good question, to note that low-income people can feel the pinch the worst as prices, especially food prices and rent and those sorts of things accelerate. But the whole point is to be sensitive to the limitations and to avoid that kind of setting off that kind of inflation as a result of government policy.
So one last question from our registrants. It's been said that the government could pay for things like universal health care, for example, by simply increasing taxes on the richest 1%. Is that really enough? And is the vision that Bernie Sanders had plausible by just tax increases, without resorting to a different approach to monetary policy?
So, what he'll say with respect, you asked about healthcare in particular?
Yes.
Yeah, so, right now, he would say that we're already paying. People say, well, how are you going to pay for Medicare for all? And the answer really is we're already paying for it. We're just paying more than any other country in the world. So moving to a system of Medicare for all means paying less than we're already paying. And, getting to the point where you say, right now people are paying in the form of copays and deductibles and premiums, and instead of doing that, they're going to make some other type of payment, whether we call it a healthcare premium or a tax, and it does matter, by the way, what you call it, but that we would end up paying less for it at the end of the day, and whether taxes have to increase or not is, again, it comes down to the real economy. It's, can you do it without creating an inflation problem? And if you can't, then there's an economic reason for cooling things off by taking some income away from people by taxing.
Well, again, this has been fantastic.
Thank you.
I think many in the audience were, hopefully are feeling a little more optimism, perhaps, than they were coming in, which is wonderful, I think, in these times. And I look forward to learning and hearing more as you put forward these very provocative, but also very important conversations for our country. Please join me again in thanking Professor Kelton.